I'm Lindsay Conroy, Director of Policy and Strategic Engagement here at the 5% Club, and we're an employer movement created by employers for employers to generate positive action to create high quality, inspirational, and inclusive earn and learn opportunities for all. On today's episode, I'm really pleased to be joined by Phil Smith, Chair of Skills England. Skills England have just released their annual report, and today we're going to be having a conversation about the key themes that have come from that report. Thank you, Phil, for coming back. It's really great to see you again. Skills England have just published the annual report, so some really interesting themes coming out of there, 5 big kind of chunky themes that we're seeing. Love to be able to dig into some of those with you today. Why don't we kick off and talk about young people, employability skills, kind of that Gen Z unreadiness for work, particularly in light of what we saw from Milburn's interim review recently
Yeah.
as well. Kind of where are your thoughts in this space?
No, so it's great to be here again, Lindsay. And it's good to have this kind of continuity as we talk about these things on a more continuous basis, because I think having the conversation is really important. So the report, really important that we have this report on a periodic basis for Skills England, try and give a bit of a sense of state of the nation, the landscape, where it is, and so on. As you say, some big themes out of it, but particularly coincidentally, or maybe brilliant planning, the Milburn Inter report comes out in a similar sort of time, and of course, it's addressing this extremely challenging issue of young people who can't get onto the ladder, can't get onto the employment ladder. And yet we see in the report itself the fact that there are significant skill shortages in the system, and that the in the priority sectors there's 1.8 million jobs, 25% of jobs over the next 10 years, which are going to need filled. I think, well, that's really tough. So how can that be the case when we've still got all these younger people trying to get onto the system? And of course, what would be very easy to do without necessarily this sort of diagnosis that the Milburn report has done, it'd be very easy. Oh, that's just about there aren't enough placements, or people are not ready for work or whatever. It's a complex position. It's
Yeah.
a complex story, as you know. You've got, as we discussed, I think the last time we were chatting, 300,000 of those people are not on any benefits. So it's not like they're sitting around, getting benefits and just wanting to do. There's a very complex mismatch of here. But there's also this completely understandable position of young people not really understanding what the skills they need are, and employers in some cases not able to understand the skills that some of these young people have. And actually, when you and I were together yesterday, I was chatting to one of the young people who was with us, and she was telling me that she, before she went into employment, she didn't really know what the skills the employers wanted, or even how to express the
Yeah.
skills she had to that employer. Now, she was lucky enough to get a job, and when she was in, she realized a lot of things she had were actually exactly what they want, and likewise they did as well. But that was a kind of really interesting dynamic. And I think we're seeing that a lot, which is that young people are not able to articulate the skills they have, and employers are not recognizing those skills that may be already there. One of the things that we hear talked about a lot is sort of is kind of ready for work skills, being able to turn up and all this sort of thing. And yet many of those young people who are maybe in more difficult environments have had to handle quite complex things, avoiding risk, all these sorts of areas, which wouldn't naturally be recognized by the employers. So some of the work the Skills England doing around, codifying, for example, the skills. So you will be aware of the fact that we announced what we call the standard skills
Yeah.
classification. So how do we codify skills? And this hasn't, I don't think it's been done comprehensively for many years, which talk about, many of the common skills that are needed, but talk about skills at all levels in different jobs. And that then gives the opportunity for people to recognize skills that are part of jobs that people can actually articulate in terms of the skills they need. And of course, that paves the way to things like skills passports, and maybe opportunities for young people to say, well, actually, I've worked in a shop and I've done whatever. I can codify some of those skills, or I've had caring responsibilities. I can show that I can do these kind of things. So I think that sort of position of trying to be realistic and down to earth about what the actual skills are that young people need, as opposed to what is often done at all levels of people taking a view of, oh, they're not ready for this, they're not done for that, sort of putting the blame onto the young people as opposed to saying, how can we make a system that works for them and starts them on the path of employment? So really important, and something that certainly as part of the report has been highlighted, and I think, as you say, alongside the Melbourne Review, something we really need to take significant action on now. So.
I think there's some really good work happening, isn't there, around how do we help young people make that identification of skill? Like you're saying, if you've got a young person who's, I don't know, maybe played in a football team, that teamwork, that leadership skills, maybe that coaching skill, etc. And quite often, what they can't do is take what's happening in life and articulate it in a CV or a job
Yeah,
application. There's something in that, and I know there is work happening in this space.
sure.
There's lots of people that
Skills
are
hubs and things
operating,
like
yeah,
that. Yeah.
operating in this space for sure. There's something around though in there about this need to join up not just the skills system, but how do we join the education system in, and how do we make sure that we're being really coherent here? Because actually, I think, and I think you probably agree with me that unless we do that, our ability to challenge and tackle that neat crisis that we've got at the moment, we're not going to make the differences
No.
unless we do bring the systems together. How do we do that?
No, you're entirely right. And of course, we all understand that from our own perspective. A human being, if you ring up someone and you just bought something and you talk to the person, they've got no record of you buying it. And maybe even if you transfer it to another department, they ask you all the same. I mean, it's really frustrating.
Yeah.
And so I think from that perspective, we've got to put ourselves into the situation of the customer in this case, whether that be a young person or maybe a small business or whomever, but someone who says, how do we make it easier for them to do this? And I've talked a lot to you and to others in the past about simplifying the system. And I recognize that sometimes that can be assumed that, well, you've got to somehow change the system completely. Simplification is often about helping people to navigate things using their language, using things that are recognized by them rather than, taking it from a system perspective. Again, we all know that historically that when we were in the past, looking at the early days of the web, for example, you'd still be typing in really complex part numbers and things. It didn't mean anything to you, but meant something to the company. So it was their view of the world rather than your view. Nowadays, of course, particularly with AI, you just chat to someone, you say, I'm keen to do something, I'll speak in my language, and it'll somehow interpret that into something that means something for you. So I think we've got to work out a lot better way of providing much simpler perspective of the system. That requires not only the front end like that, but the back end to be joined up. And you've mentioned before, the backup, you've got DFE, DWP, DBT. These are all department names of which most people have no idea what they even mean, but they are all departments who have ownership of different things. So somewhere or another, we've got to show a much more joined up approach. And there are some really good signs of that. For example, the industrial strategy was owned by one, the business department, but actually it's right across the piece, from home office through to DFE and to Skills England, obviously. And, likewise, when you look at some of the areas where, we're really trying to get a kind of proper joined up perspective of things. Skills England should be that as well. Skills England now happens to be housed in DWP, but we need to pull together everybody's capabilities in there to deliver that to a young person. Because a young person, of course, is a broad term in itself. It could be somebody who's under 16. It could be somebody who's 16 to 19. It could be somebody who's 19 plus. You would still talk about them as a young person. And you'll not be surprised to know that many of those are handled by different government departments. We need to stick that together. We need to say, you don't have to worry about the wiring at the back. Let's just say, this is how it looks at the front for you. And, you can access it in this particular way, which is sort of the beauty of the local side of things.
Yeah.
And I know we'll maybe talk a bit more about that, but that idea of place, you're sort of boiling the complexity down. You're saying, okay, it's still complex when you're in Manchester or in Leeds or wherever, but it's an order of magnitude less complex than the whole country. So let's try and make it local. And actually, most people, particularly young people, probably would recognize the local college or maybe some local business rather than some national program that they don't quite understand how it works. So making it relevant, making it local, making it simple and accessible and going to where people are, I think must be the way to do it.
It does feel like it's, a really positive step forward, doesn't it? And particularly, if we're thinking about that place-based approach, for me, it feels like getting that approach is all about activating the SMEs in the area. If we can get SMEs across the country, because of course they are the backbone of employment within the UK, to really activate and provide those opportunities, they'll surely be the ones that are, creating more and more chances then for those young people coming through. And they'll be the ones that are recruiting from the local
Yeah,
areas,
yeah,
etc. So I think there's a big question here around how do we activate that
yeah.
SME community? Because you talk about complexity, most SMEs don't know what they're entitled to, never mind how to go about getting it. And short of creating manual intervention that will require a lot of people resource, that's going to be really tough to activate that
No, I
community. What are your
agree. And
thoughts?
and there's sort of two scales to that. There's the sort of bigger supply chain type bit, which we've talked about in the past, but there's a good example there. So in Skills England now we have a thing called the Infrastructure Support Service, which said if there's a big project, which has usually got some sort of anchor employer, but there's usually loads of people in the supply chain around it, can we do something like that? So we recently did stuff with Bridgewater, down in Bridgewater with Agritas, who are the big battery manufacturer,
Mhm.
who they come in. We want to do this massive thing, but of course there's loads of companies around them. So what we've done is a sort of a kind of wraparound service to say, okay, if that's going to be as significant as it could be, lots of apprenticeship, lots of people, lots of jobs, lots of supply chain, let's wrap our arms around that and make it work for that. Then there's the other end of the scale where you've got, much more distributed small business in some random place somewhere who doesn't, see what the support is and so on. And so to that point, we need to find ways of not talking to people in terms of, you need level three apprentices who are doing what, I mean, you can imagine somebody just going, zzz, zoning over. And in fact, if you look at a lot of government stuff, you'll see, oh, there's 1 million here for that, and you can get 1,000 for that, and you can get, I mean, that's fine if you're in the system and you've got, but actually, if you're someone who's short on time, you don't want to spend all your time doing that. You want to actually just do the job. So, so I do think we need to make it easier for people to get access to that kind of support. And it's often so. First way is to talk about it in language that they talk about. So if you're talking to a small business, you could talk about productivity and all those sorts of things. But actually, what you might want to talk about is the fact that if you do some of this stuff and get some help, you can have weekends off occasionally, and you can maybe not work, go on holiday occasionally because you're bringing on people who can help you to do things. But that's a different way of speaking. Speaking about the issues that they have, you want to make payroll, you want to. So, how do you get both technology and people to help you do that? And I think the truth is, Lindsay, that actually, your observation is exactly right. You could do that by having people thrown at it, and everybody would love to have their own personal training account manager who worked with them and told them about all the apprenticeships and found all the thing. And and there's a role for that. And there's a brokerage pilot going on at the moment, a set of pilots going on around the country, which are sort of doing that. They're sort of, okay, we'll take the safeguarding and all that complicated stuff. We'll give you the young person and they can then work
Mhm.
with you. But that's ultimately, it's great to get, and that gets some people over the hump and then they start doing it themselves. But it's got limitations because it's expensive
Yeah.
and people intensive. Technology's got to be part of the answer to this. I mean, we all know that the real killer application for AI at the moment is the fact that you can talk to it. All right. Now, it's super smart, it can do amazing things, but the reality is you can interface it with either very simple language, pure normal English or any language you speak, and you can talk to it. And so, therefore, if you're a small business and you're actually trying to say, I did try this example, I went on to ChatGPT and to Claude and to Gemini. In fact, I tried it on all of them, or all those three. And I went on and said, I'm a small business. I live in Warwickshire. I'm in manufacture. I've got 20 people. I've no idea what to do. I don't know where to start. I haven't got any money. What should I do? And you'll not be surprised to know it came up with a pretty credible answer. You told me what I should think of my workforce, who my local college was, what sort of grants are available. Now, it may not have been complete, but I think we need to think about that kind of access to technology as a way of helping. Because if we try to reinvent that, let's say if you handed it to a government department and said, can you go and invent this? What they would do is create some horribly clunky tool that wouldn't look anything like that. So why don't we just use the technology that's there? And yeah, okay, wrap around some privacy, wrap around some other stuff around it. It's not beyond the wit of man. I mean, I've talked to most of the tech companies, they'd all be willing to help us do that. And so we're talking about those sorts of things with people, and part of the AI work we're doing, we're working with a lot of those companies and looking at whether we could maybe do something to help people with AI skills. So I think the long and short of it is there's big end, big infrastructure, supply chain stuff. There's low end. We can make it simpler for people, even just in the language you use. But ultimately, if we genuinely want to break the one, not the one to one, but the linear, for every 10 people, you need another one person. We've got to use technology to do it.
I think so, and I think you can imagine a world, can't you, where there is an agent that actually has all of that information literally at your
Yep. At your
fingertips, and
fingertips.
then you take out that kind of very expensive,
Yep.
needing to talk to someone on a
Yep.
everyday basis, and perhaps those that they're there for the exceptional
Yeah, exactly.
circumstances.
And they're blended into it.
Mm.
So it's not, hand it to the robots. This is about of how do you blend it with someone who's an expert, but has essentially at their whim another 1,000 helpers who could
Yeah.
help them do it. I mean, that's pretty handy.
Well, exactly. It feels like that has to be the way, and utilizing the networks that I think that already exist. So, I always say to employers, talk to your training providers. Your training providers are
Yeah,
the
no,
people that they're in this every
yeah.
day. They can tell you what to do.
But also you and, your organizations and, 5% Club, apprenticeship. I mean, these are bodies who understand things and can help you. There's a lot of help out there. I
Yeah.
mean, the great thing about the 5% Club is, everybody in there all helps each other. I mean, it's kind of how it works. You get that in business a lot. If you've got local businesses who are working around, you know that they all go and go, have you tried this thing? Can I try? Hey,
Yeah.
people want to do things that are people like them, so, helping is powerful.
No, you're absolutely right. And we've got prime examples of people that, they come on, they join us as a member, and they might just be starting out. So, when we tie them up with people that have already achieved what they want to achieve, or, have done something really
Yeah.
similar, that's where they find their biggest source of information.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the SME piece, which I think is probably the toughest nut to crack,
Yeah, I agree.
actually.
But a huge thing, a huge benefit if we can get it, because big numbers,
Absolutely,
isn't it?
because I really think that's where we will start to see, significant change. What I suppose what worries me and what I hear from employers, particularly the large national employers, is if we go down this route of devolving and we take the place-based approach, how do we make that make sense at a national level for those large employers who, let's be honest, if they're based across the whole of the UK, they probably already find it difficult to interact with England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and
Yeah.
Scotland. If you give them another dozen or so local authorities on top of that, we could risk turning large employers off. So,
Yeah.
how do we make it make sense with a national infrastructure, do you
Yeah,
think?
I think that's a really important question, because I think, you can go to Evil Max and just say, go for it, take all the money, off you go. And, there's clearly some people who would like to do that. And I have a lot of sympathy with why that is the case. But to your point, and it's not just for the big employers who want to do that, the individual who then goes around and
Yeah.
moves around and sees a different system. So somewhere or another, we need to find a way of doing that. Where, and I was talking to one of the select committees this morning about numeracy, and the job of numeracy is something that's built into the apprenticeship standards and so on, where it's relevant.
Hmm.
So in particular jobs, you've got numeracy which is relevant for a particular job. If you're doing a catering job, you need to understand numeracy in terms of ingredients and all the sort of things, and maybe payments. If you're doing a sort of project management job, you need to. So, but in underpinning that, so you've got kind of occupational standards, then you've got things like, obviously the qualifications and so on, which have got, GCSEs or those sort of different levels and things. So I think what we need to find is a blend of kind of recipe ingredients, and those could be, things like occupational standards and such like that. You say, you've got to have this kind of capability, but the way you actually dish it up can be different for different people. I've always thought of it as a bit like a kind of franchise model. And I know that's not how people necessarily see it when you're in those devolved areas. They're like, give me the money and go away. Um, I think we need to find a blend of that, because the employers they're working with will certainly want to do stuff which is more reactive and more sensitive to them. But when one of the things that we've seen quite a lot is that people come back and say, yeah, but we need to give it some kind of qualification. We need to give it some sort of, credibility, if you will. And in fact, we even found that in the AI boost work, which I'm involved in, which is training the 10 million people on AI, which is being delivered by the tech companies themselves using their curriculum, the big ask they had was, oh, is there some kind of badge we can put on that? So Skills England have put on a kind of digital badge
Yeah.
for certain ones of it, which fulfill certain criteria. So they've got to fulfill the criteria of the knowledge, skills, tasks, and behaviors that are within that. And if they do, it's sort of light touch, we'll give it a badge. So I think we've got to experiment with that a bit. I think we've got to find ways where we let the pendulum swing a bit towards the distribution. That's important, and distributed and place based. But we find ways of giving some consistency within that. So it's definitely an issue, and it's definitely something we're trying to address. And I think it's this sort of balance between heavy handedness. You've got to do it exactly this way, or you've got to do it. I mean, the example I've used probably in the past is the sort of, it's like McDonald's, you got to sell hamburgers, you got to have a big M.
On that note, for me, there's a big question around how do we help employers with not just the focus on, say, young people and bringing people out of school, because you talk to most, in particular big employers, but also loads of SMEs, they will take people on,
Yeah.
particularly on those level 3, 4, higher and degree level apprenticeships,
Yeah.
etc. There's a gap for me, I think, between those people and the people that really need that work to get them kind of ready for that level of learning. And I think that's the bit that probably we haven't nailed
Yeah.
yet. We've obviously seen the advent of foundation
Yeah.
apprenticeships. We've probably not seen them take off quite as
Yeah.
much as we'd
Yeah.
want at the moment. But there's something here, I think, that we need to be talking to employers about. We know that the face of really entry level roles, the types of roles, I worked in a shop in New Look actually when I was at college, and most of my friends would have done the same. Those types of roles are changing, they're disappearing.
Yeah. Yeah.
The high street is obviously becoming a more challenging place to work. I think there's something about a conversation with employers around, what makes it valuable for you as an employer to really start bringing in at the grassroots, because then they start to fish from different, pools of talent.
The trouble is, it's so obvious to the people it's obvious for. I went along to see this little company in Coventry, XL Motors, started by a guy, brilliant little company. And, they've now got pretty much all the young people are apprentices. Pretty much all the managers are all ex-apprentices. They do work experience, placements, whatever. Now, they're a small business, but they just totally buy into the fact that they see the people, the talent comes to them, they get exposure of their company. So they've kind of got over, crossed the Rubicon, if you will, of this is a good thing to do. And I just somehow feel that we've not done a good enough job in showing people that if they do that, they're really good people you're bringing on board. And everybody I talk to who's got, let's take apprentices particularly, you've got apprentices on board, they're like, "God, these people just bring such energy into the company. They're so exciting. They do." We've got to find a way of getting that. And that's probably is going to require some incentives to get people over the hump, or some really good examples, or maybe some sort of cataclysmic event that makes people do it. But I do think that if you can get people over that, and some of the brokerage work and all these things are ways of doing that. But once they get over it, it's amazing. And I know, when I came to spoke at the 5% Club thing, I mean, your people were just like, you didn't have to persuade them. They were just
Yeah.
absolutely singing the praises of this. And that's not because they're different from any other business. They've just got over that hump,
Yeah.
and suddenly they've realized it's a great thing to do, so.
So I'm probably going to wrap us up there, because I think sadly we are out of time, although I suspect we could have carried on talking about this for a long time. But you are right, isn't it? It's about how do we inspire that
Yeah.
positive action, and that's what we're here for as well. So look, I'm really grateful you were able to come back and
No,
join
I
us
really enjoyed
today.
it.
We'll obviously be including some links to the report in the show notes for today. So just thank you so much for your time, and I shall look forward to speaking to you again soon. If today's conversation has sparked any ideas or helped you to think about things differently, then we'd love for you to share it with your colleagues and across your social channels. You can find everything that we've talked about in the episode linked in the show description, including the Skills England annual report, links to the 5% Club, and all of the support and help that we can offer you. And you can find more episodes, resources and guidance at www.5percentclub.org.uk. Join us next time for more insight, innovation and practical learning on Take 5.